Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special GZERO media live stream produced in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm Diana Fox-Carney, a senior advisor at Eurasia Group. Today, we're talking about a growing global food crisis impacting hundreds of millions of people. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has described it as a hurricane of hunger, a perfect storm brought on by COVID, the pandemic, and the impacts of climate change and the war in Ukraine. Today, we're going to examine the causes of the crisis, the political and humanitarian consequences, and the solutions that could prevent further starvation and acute hunger. Eurasia Group recently published the report, Food Security and the Coming Storm. Amongst its many headlines is the forecast that there's a 95% chance that by November, the number of people facing food insecurity will rise between 142 and 243 million, from the roughly 1.6 billion who already faced food insecurity in May. I really want to underscore that point. Around 20% or even 30% by some reckoning of the global population was already food insecure this spring, and the numbers are forecast to rise by about 200 million from now. For more on this staggering statistic, we're joined by Ian Bremmer, president and founder of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and by Mark Suzman, CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome.
Good.
Ian, put the scope of this problem into perspective. Why has Eurasia's food report resonated so broadly, and what do you see as the key takeaways?
Well, first of all, because it's a baseline scenario. We're not talking about what happens in 30 years' time to the world if we don't respond aggressively to climate change. We're talking about what happens in the remainder of this year, assuming the war goes the way we expect it's going to go. And, you know, there are a lot of people around the world that look at the Ukraine crisis. In fact, a majority of the people that say you're focusing so much on that and you didn't care so much when you were leaving Afghanistan, or when we had massive problems in Yemen or Syria or Libya or Sudan, so many other countries, it's because it's Europe, right? And I accept that criticism, but the fact is that this war in Ukraine is going to have so much more impact on the poorest people in the world, precisely because of the food and fertilizer and energy disruption and dislocation. And the world was slow to come to that realization. And I do believe that this report, as well as the Secretary General's strong admonition that this was a top priority for the year, has focused the minds. And if we're talking about, I mean, you mentioned the food stress category in the world, but I'd focus on the additional 7 million people that we expect to be on the edge of famine this year as a consequence of the war. And frankly, if you want to look at human suffering, that is it's exponentially greater than the 44 million Ukrainians that are directly involved in this unjust war itself. I think that's why. Thank you, Ian.
Mark, I'd love your thoughts on what Ian has just said, but I'd also love you to just introduce the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and how your work intersects with the area of food insecurity.
Yes, so for the foundation, one of the areas that we focused on is agricultural development, particularly looking at the very poorest. 2/3 of the world's very poorest, those living on $2 a day or less, depend on the agricultural sector for food and income. They're largely smallholder farmers in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. And we do a wide range of investments, from helping provide improved seeds, farming practices, tools, access to markets, connection to some of global partnerships and support to do that. And this is an ongoing need and an ongoing priority. In the context of the current crisis that the report highlights and that Ian cited, these come together in a massive way. It is these communities that are most affected by being unable to both purchase the staples they do depend on, the rural poor and urban poor, but also in terms of that access to fertilizer, seeds, other tools and products That's why what's not fully recognized, although the report does outline some of it, is we are building in what is likely to be a much longer term problem, because you're going to see future cycles of crop cycles where there are insufficient fertilizer, insufficient water irrigation, and we're not going to be producing enough food even outside of challenges like exporting wheat from Ukraine and other global breadbasket areas. So what we're trying to do is, how do we do the combination of both addressing this incredibly acute short-term crisis, which is putting these many, many millions of lives at risk, both at risk of death at the most extreme version because of famine, but longer-term risk of malnutrition and food insecurity. But also think about this over the long term, because in the context of climate change and the need for climate adaptation, while these problems may have been hugely exacerbated by COVID, the Ukrainian war, and other short-term crises, they are long-term challenges that the world has to grapple with if we are going to succeed in helping reduce poverty and provide food security for these populations.
That's really helpful to think about the long-term situation. I think the point that this is really a global crisis, it has been made, and there are some people who are acutely susceptible to this problem, but it is global. And the UN had predicted that food prices would rise by around 20% over this year. In fact, we've seen wheat prices falling a little bit in recent months, but US food inflation is higher than it's been for 4 decades. And in Kenya, food inflation is running at double digits. So this really is everywhere. And before this live stream, GZERO Media conducted a poll with our viewers as to what they think about the food prices. So the first question we asked them is about how rising food prices have affected their household. So firstly, we asked, do they buy different products? Have they modified their diet? Do they comparison shop, or has it not yet affected the way they go shopping? So let's look at the results we have from that poll. Great. So we've got 35% say not at all. So it's yet to impact what they're doing. But all the others are thinking of ways of modifying what they do. 22% buying different products, changing their diet, which also I assume means buying different products, and comparison shopping more often. So it really is global. And Ian, coming back to you, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, famously said, hungry people are angry people. What does that mean to you, both in the US and in the globe more broadly?
It's a fundamental transition in how we think about progress. For the last 50 years, humanity was defined primarily by globalization. And globalization, of course, people talk about how the top 1% in the world got so much richer, and the banks and the multinational corporations and the individuals who had shares in those organizations. But the much more important component of globalization was the emergence of a global middle class, access of the world to each other's markets, and the competitive advantage of trade as a consequence meant that we reduced hunger, meant that we reduced challenges in life expectancy and infant mortality, meant that we expanded opportunities for education. And as I was growing up and going to school and going to college, that was the world that I was excited to be a part of. And what we're seeing, both because of the pandemic and also worse on the back of this Russia invasion and the high levels, the interest rates going up, the high levels of inflation, the supply chain shortages, is that suddenly the global middle class is eroding. It's getting weaker. There are fewer members of it around the world. And indeed, people are slipping back into becoming hungrier, into becoming angrier. Now, there are a lot of people that are angry about the fact that many of the wealthiest in the world neglected the need to redistribute resources effectively to the middle classes in their own wealthy societies. And that needs to be addressed in a big way. That's why there's not much support for free trade in a country like the United States or even in the EU today. But much more urgent is the fact that the trajectory and the creation of a much more robust global middle class is now slipping towards greater extreme poverty and greater hunger. And I would argue, in addition to what Klaus said, that hungry people are angry people, but also hungry people are much less interested in being part of global solutions. And their governments will reflect that and will be captured by that. So this is an enormously urgent priority for governance around the world.
It's really interesting to point out the backsliding. I think we've become fairly used to the idea that we're moving forward in a number of areas, and there's clearly backsliding going on. And Mark, just last week we saw the release of the annual flagship report on the state of food security and nutrition. And in that, they pointed out that the progress we've made to reverse on child stunting is on the cusp of being reversed. And still around 22% of kids globally are stunted. At the same time, of course, we have about 6% of kids globally that are overweight. So we have problems on both ends of the spectrum. In addition, that report pointed out the gender impacts of the food crisis. Women are disproportionately affected, and a huge number of women are, between the age of about 15 and 50 are affected by anemia. That's about 1 in 3 women globally. On a positive note, they suggested that there is a lot of money going into the food and agriculture sector, but it's not going into the right things, I think was the point they made. So could you just talk to us again from the perspective of the foundation? Could you just suggest how you see this space evolving and what some of these difficult intersections are that you're trying to address?
Absolutely. So first, just to build on Ian's point, it's important to remember that the crisis we're facing now is coming on the back of what was essentially 2 decades of pretty unprecedented global progress. Progress in terms of reducing hunger, reducing poverty, expanding education, expanding basic access to healthcare tools from vaccinations to antiretrovirals, that we have seen huge progress. And the investing in food security more broadly in agricultural development was one of the real bright spots where we saw massive expansion of investments across the world. And we saw reductions, as we say, in all these food insecurity and nutrition challenges. Your point about stunting is, it's a word to most people, but what stunting means is a stunted child will never have their brain and body fully develop to what would have been their full potential. It's not something you recover from or catch up from. So that has profound implications if we have an increase in stunting and wasting from the current crisis that is built into then a full generation across the countries where they're affected. And that's why it's so incredibly important that we do make investments, and they say the right kind of investments. And those need to be, there's the humanitarian response, which is obviously critical, those in desperate need who are on the verge of starvation. But then there are the longer term, more thoughtful sets of investments in broader food security, agricultural development, climate adaptation. We know we're in an era of more frequent droughts and floods. We know there are wider challenges facing all these economies, and that's simply not happening at the global level. That it's great, for example, that the G7 did make a commitment of $4.5 billion in their recent summit. But by comparison, and I'm sure Ian will have thoughts on this given his own reflections about how global power has been dissipating, but the G8, the old G8 summit of 2009, which dealt with the large food security crisis in L'Aquila, actually made a set of investments of $20 billion over 3 years that were much more focused on long-term agricultural development as well as the short-term crisis. So even the scale and size of the response now is so far short of what's really needed to try and address and tackle these critical issues.
Thank you, Mark. Now, Mark and Ian, please stay with us because we're going to hear from you later in the program. But for now, I want to talk to 2 other people to have a deeper discussion about these converging crises that we've mentioned already, conflict, climate change, and COVID. And joining me now are 2 of the world's foremost experts in this space. So we have Ertharin, who's founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future and the former executive director of the UN World Food Programme. Welcome, Ertharin.
Thank you.
And we also have Kathryn Hollifield, and she's Program Manager for the Global Agriculture and Food Security Programme. So picking up on what Ian and Mark have just been saying, Ertharin, can you give us your view of why things have unraveled so very quickly in this space?
Well, I think Ian and Mark covered it quite well, but let me just emphasize the road that we were on that has led to the points that we are discussing here today. The Sophie report that you mentioned back in 2020 was already beginning to alert the world to the challenges of climate, conflict, and economic instability as factors that were increasing those who are severely or acutely hungry. And so then that with that discussion already underway, then there was COVID. And with COVID, we saw an additional increase from 130 to 276 million people who were severely or acutely hungry. And that severe hunger was directly related to the failure, not of the global food system, but of regional and local food systems. When you shut down the ability of farmers to move product, particularly produce, from the rural areas into the cities, and they were required to drive during the day where there's no refrigerated trucks, where you have limited logistic support and warehousing or processing. And so the 40% loss that is experienced on an annual basis, on a regular basis, in post-harvest produce loss was exacerbated as a result of COVID because of these conditions. We saw up to in some countries, Senegal, for example, 70% losses between the farm gate and the marketplace. And as a result, higher prices of food, increased challenges of affordability, less access to food, more hungry people. So there was a conversation that was ongoing about how do we build back better after COVID in these communities. And then you had the Russian invasion into Ukraine, with a significant number of the countries, particularly in East Africa and in the Middle East, receiving significant portions of their wheat from Ukraine. We have seen a skyrocket in the numbers that you've already begun to talk about, a projection that the UN is saying of an additional 345 million people who will be potentially severely food insecure as a result of the Ukraine crisis. And what David Beasley, my successor at the World Food Program, continues to underscore is that 50% of the commodities that they distribute came from Ukraine. And as a result, while they are receiving increased contributions, the cost for them then for replacing those grains means that they're feeding fewer people. And he is now suggesting that we could see an additional 50 million people in 45 countries now just one step away from famine. So that humanitarian challenge that Mark spoke of is one that continues to exacerbate. But I want to underscore here an important point. And that is, we often talk about the handoff between humanitarian response and development response. We don't need a handoff. We need the work performed simultaneously, because the challenge that we're experiencing is one that is directly related to smallholder farmers' ability to, during COVID, to produce and then to market and move their food. And now, because of the challenges of fertilizer, their inability, and fertilizer and fuel, their inability to plant during this planting season. And so, yes, we must meet that humanitarian response, but we must also meet the challenges of that midterm, the development requirement that is necessary to avoid 6 months from now an increase in number of people who are hungry. 12 months from now, what is now being suggested is that we move from a food affordability crisis to a food availability crisis. That is not about high price food. It is about food being unavailable, because 80% of the food that is consumed in the countries that are most affected by the challenges that we're discussing is produced by smallholder farmers.
That's a really interesting point, because for a long time, we've understood that famine is a result of lack of access, but not actually lack of food. And what you're saying is that we're dealing with those lack of access problems now, but it could then turn into a lack of food problem, particularly around the fertilizer issue, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But first, I'm going to go to Kathryn and just ask you about the SDGs. Kathryn, they've been described as being on life support now. They've been important to us globally for many years now. And again, we have been making progress. But what's happened on these SDGs? And are we about to lose those goals?
I think, and the previous speakers have spoken very well to this, that there have been a lot of challenges out there that some very unexpected when we look at the kind of shocks, the global shocks that we faced over the last couple of years. Some I think that we were seeing emerge, and because it's a little bit like the frog in the boiling water, the water has been getting warmer and warmer, and it's hard to actually sometimes coalesce and get people really active and moving when you see people that are closer to being in the boiling water and they're just not happening. So there's this accumulation of shocks that are out there that really the tipping point has been the impacts that we've seen from the Ukraine, Russia situation, but it doesn't underemphasize the critical importance of these systemic and longer term both shocks and crises and stresses that were already there and really were already affecting so fundamentally the progress that could be made in many of these countries. I mean, you're looking at the endemic conflict that seems to be out there across different countries, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, parts of other countries as well. You're looking at the rising levels of sort of natural disasters and more extreme shocks that come through the normal cycles of droughts and normal dryness that also exacerbate the situation in these countries. And when you layer them all together, that really has put severe stress and really undermined the ability to meet the SDGs. But let's I would like to look at this also in terms of just the level of commitment that we've seen across the development community as well. And I guess it has been a lot of statements at the global level where we've seen the G7 come together with the Global Alliance in Food Security. We've seen the whole UN partners, the whole UN system coming together under different initiatives as well. We've seen the EU, and there's been strong commitments at the global level, but it takes me back to a comment from an earlier speaker as well. It's great that we're talking and raising the profile of this, but the action happens in the countries. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about making commitments globally and indicating that our teams on the grounds will work together. We really need to find ways to get that message down on the ground, to put the incentives on the ground so that those teams that are working all out to meet their own institutional requirements actually take the time to reach across the street, to reach across the table even, and coordinate better with what their other partners are doing. It reminds me, and I was really welcomed the comment by Ertharin in terms of the divide or the transition between the humanitarian response, the short-term development response, and the long-term response. It really is about trying to put in place a more seamless community on the ground that is responding very directly to the ownership and the leadership that the partner countries, the lowest income countries, are already making. I mean, they're using UN processes, things such as the UN FSS and the pathways, to really develop strategies that pick up the points that you're talking about on the climate side of things. They know, they see the impacts of climate. They also are some of the strongest practitioners on the ground with smallholders that know very well what undermining their natural resource base does to their the kind of inheritance they can leave for their children to continue to produce. They are also the ones, the women on the ground are the ones that we know can be resilient, can react quickly, and they need to be empowered. So from the perspective of the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, it really is about reinforcing, making sure the incentives are there so that the countries have strategies, that the development partners come together and respond coherently in a harmonized way to these strategies, and get the money in the hands of the smallholders themselves so that they do what they know what they need to do, or we give them the advice and experience and help from their counterparts in other countries to make it happen. To me, this is a critical part of it. Let's get off the global stage for a minute and focus on getting support to the ground and having our teams on the ground talk to each other.
That's a really good point. I think it's tempting for us to think of it as just a global issue, which it clearly is not. Time now for our second poll question. We asked our followers on social media about the causes or the greatest threat to food security. So all these things have a part to play, but the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, and climate change. And you'll see from the results that, in fact, climate change was by far and away the biggest concern for people. And this is this long-term position that, Ertharin, you were talking about. I want to bring in at this point a question related to climate change from a listener in Kenya, Angelina. And she's pointed out that we have been thinking about climate change at a global level, but she wants to think about kind of shared resources and water resources in particular, resources such as the Nile River, which are important. Mm-hmm. So how can you get the balance between what you've described, Kathryn, as that sort of country level action and the need to coordinate regionally and between countries on issues such as sharing water to enable irrigation to combat the climate threat? Do you have any thoughts on that, Kathryn?
Yes, I think part of it is let me think about it a little bit in terms of the regional side of it. I think even before you get to the regional side of it, you do also actually have to empower and give the tools on the ground to those that actually use the water to make them more aware of the longer term impacts of what they're doing. Water is one of those traditional public goods that it's very difficult to try and put in place mechanisms where people recognize the value of sharing it over time and making sure that everybody gets some access to it. So the body of water could be between two different municipalities. You really need to develop that sense in terms of this is a long-term resource that we all have to manage. You look for the ways for them to be managing the resources so that they are looking at the longer term. It obviously only gets worse when you start going beyond the boundaries of countries. But to me, it is very much about supporting informed decision-making, putting in place and supporting the kind of assistance so that they can come together as maybe producer organizations or water user associations so that they know that they can communally make decisions on the use of that water and they see what happens when they actually withdraw the water, over withdraw it or misuse it through different ways. So these kind of mechanisms, there's a lot of examples globally where this can be done in a more cooperative way by using local level decision making and informed local level decision making, but it's not easy. That's, I think, part of the solution is to put the hands and the decision making back in those that actually see the impact of the decisions that they're taking individually or as communities.
Thank you, Kathryn. I want now to come back to the issue of fertilizer. This is a dual food and fertilizer crisis because of where much of our fertilizer comes from in Russia and Ukraine. So, Ertharin, you've written about this and you've talked about the need also for biological fertilizer or for alternatives to our current kind of fertilizer regime. Perhaps you can just describe, I mean, you already talked about the longer term impacts, the food production impacts of lack of fertilizer, but perhaps you can talk about where you see this going or what the possibilities might be to address this in a more meaningful long-term way.
Well, first of all, we need to remember that 1 in every 2 people consume a diet dependent on fertilizers, and that chemical fertilizers are part of the package of tools that we will need to ensure that we have that diverse bucket of solutions that will help us produce more, but produce it better. Fertilizers today are used in too many places and overused and misused, creating soil challenges of varying degrees. The question is not to eliminate fertilizers, it is how do we use them better? The question is how do we move to sustainable intensification as one of the tools using fertilizer that will help us to support particularly those places where soils are challenged, and fertilizers are definitely necessary to support the increase in production that is required to feed the populations, but that, as I talked about, those 500 million smallholder farmers who produce 80% of the food and needing to increase ever more without putting more land under cultivation. And so we need a combination of the new and old tools but to be used in context. It is back again to those on the ground solutions. This is not a place where we should say, this is the answer from a global level. Soils are different in every geographic region and even in some of the same communities. And so what they require to maximize the production and to protect those soils may be quite different. But the problem is the tools that are coming online for affluent farmers. They're coming online in affluent countries. They're not being made available in a broad scale way to those smallholder farmers that we're talking about. So as we talk about addressing the challenge and addressing the issues of access to fertilizer, we also need to provide those additional new tools to begin to transition farmers to sustainable intensification that supports their ability to continue to produce more now and produce it better now to protect the soils for the future.
Thank you so much, Ertharin and Kathryn. It's been great to have you with us. I know you're really the experts in this space, but you've provided also a great link to our next guest, who is Thomas GZERO, who is joining us, I believe, from Kenya, where he is the CEO and co-founder of Pula. Pula is a company that he launched to work with and to protect and ensure those smallholder farmers that Ertharin's been talking about. We also have David Laborde, and he's Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. So I think we'll go straight to Thomas and see what your reflections are initially on what's been said about putting solutions in the hands of local people and working with the farmers to ensure that they're part of the solution, not part of the problem.
So I'll start by, if you think about, so for smallholder farmers, the biggest issue is the fact that currently they produce about 30% of the world's food. But if you think from a productivity perspective, they're probably producing at a quarter of the world's comparative to sort of the large-scale farmers in developed markets, right? So if we develop solutions that can increase the productivity of these smallholder farmers and probably make them half as efficient as the large-scale farmers in developed markets, then you're talking about increasing world's food output by about 30%. Compare that with about 10% food deficit. Then we get closer to solving the problem. Now, coming closer to the problem, the current food crisis. For instance, in Nigeria, we've seen fertilizer prices increase from $25 per bag to about $125. The implication of that is that in the last couple of months, the amount of credit dispersed towards the smallholder farmers has started to reduce, if you think about it in terms of the amount, the quantum of fertilizer support going to these smallholder farmers, meaning that their production actually will continuously get affected. And beyond that is, of course, that will continue to affect the food prices in these markets, which further even worsens an already bad situation. As studies have shown that, for instance, a ton of tomatoes in in Nairobi is $400, compared to a ton of tomatoes in Chicago, which is about $100. So the world's poorest are actually paying 4 times more than the world's richest, right? And this is even worse, given that the biggest portion of their income is spent on food comparatively to other segments. So I actually echo the conversation around the need for more cooperation across the world to solve this problem. I think if you think about humanity's progress, I think cooperation has been one of the biggest drivers of progress. And this includes sort of best practice sharing. So you have a lot of solutions that do exist across the world that can come in and actually solve the existing food security problem. From our side as Pula, our focus is primarily on de-risking the smallholder farmer. I spent the first 18 years of my life on a smallholder farm, and I witnessed firsthand the harsh reality of the vagaries of the weather. And farmers, I learned, are one drought away from poverty. And later in life, of course, realizing this problem is actually a global problem. And in the absence of risk mitigation tools, then these farmers are actually very hesitant to invest optimally on their farms. They just put in what they can afford to lose. And unfortunately, as sort of you have these input prices skyrocketing, then what is happening is that which they can afford to lose is actually becoming much less. Then their productivity continues to become a bigger problem. So I think there's the need globally for cooperation across different sectors, from public sector, private sector, the foundation. I think we've had a lot of support from the foundation in solving this food crisis.
Thank you. That's really striking what you said about how these smallholder farmers are suffering. As you said, they're so fragile in the beginning, they don't have the inputs now, and they're facing themselves these extremely high food prices when they're forced to purchase food. David, perhaps I can bring you in there and ask you what you expect to see. You know, we're in an inflationary environment at the moment, but what are you expecting in terms of where food prices go from here?
So it will depend a bit about the weather we are going to have in the coming month, because that's actually the key drivers. And I think in the poll you have shown, people are aware that climate change is really the biggest threat we have on the food system. And if you even take a commodity like wheat, we are basically back to the level of prices they have before the invasion, because market adjusts, countries adjust, new exporters are coming on the market. Of course, there is sometimes some hidden cost, because what we see is Brazil, for example, is already producing more wheat, but deforestation will increase this year in Brazil to compensate the loss of land we have in Ukraine. But overall, I think really we have reached on global markets already the peak in terms of prices, and it has been a severe increase in the last year. Now, at the country level, at the grocery shop, that's where we are going to see still a few months of increase, because there is this transmission, these lags between what we see on world markets and what's happened in your grocery shop, either if you are in Chicago or in Nairobi. But we are also going to see the other effect of the Korean crisis, like the price of oil, meaning that, the food sector in itself is really dependent on transportation costs, both domestically and internationally. And potentially next year, we will have the impact of some shortages of fertilizer in some places. So we can really still continue to see rising prices at the local level, but on world markets, I will tend to say that we have seen the worst of it, except if we have more climate shock, in particular in large producing countries.
And is there anything, David, that the politicians can be thinking about doing to ensure that those prices at least don't go up again now? You did mention the energy piece of the equation, which is clearly very important, and they can think about that. But how do we ensure that we don't go backwards from here, I guess?
So the first thing to do is basically to let market adjust. And what we have seen in the first month of the crisis was this increase in the number of what we call export bans or export restrictions. So you have some countries that try to keep food at home, and that's first bad for other countries that need this food, but also that send a very negative incentive for their own farmers. Because if you cannot sell on markets when prices are high, why do you want to produce, especially if you have to pay more for your fertilizer and so on? So keep message for policymakers, don't put this export restriction. Actually, they are not only bad for other countries, they are also bad on the long term for you. And here we have a mix of evidence where obviously Indonesia has removed most of their export restrictions they put in place in March and April. But other countries like India still have some restriction that, an export restriction on wheat coming from India. The main victim today is Yemen. So you see that you have to think about how you are potentially moving the pain from low-income countries to least developed countries, and that always the poorest that unfortunately we ask them to adjust. So don't put export restriction. After, there is also to think about the type of demand driven by policies that we do on the food system, in particular biofuel. And here also from Indonesia to Brussels or Washington, we are forcing part of the agricultural commodity today to go to the energy system and feed cars, and not animal or people. So, there is a number of policy actions that can be taken to not make things worse. And that will be the first step. And then we have hopefully also a more positive agenda about what policymakers can do to provide more information to markets, and that we do at the global level with something like AMIS. But also, and to follow up on what Thomas was saying, today a lot of smallholders are facing a problem to access fertilizer. But when you talk to them, no one has informed them that it was coming, for instance. When we know that fertilizer prices have increased basically since February last year. And no one has really delivered this information to them, allowing them to take decision and to empower them to deal with that. So you see, we have a number of policies that are about providing more information to players, big or small, that can help markets operating more. And last but not least, there is still the fact that market will never really take care of the weakest or most vulnerable people and countries. And then we need redistribution. We need solidarity in terms of finance to help both poor countries to have the capacity to pay for the import bill this year, but also poor consumers and poor smallholders to not get bankrupt or fall in hunger due to the current level of prices.
Thank you, David. That was a very comprehensive view of all the things we certainly need to do. And I think it leads us well into the next poll question. We asked our followers about the most important solution to food insecurity. Is that around innovation and new technologies, around global cooperation, or around sustainable farming and agricultural development? So let's have the results for that poll now. There we go. So 22% are focused on those new technologies. 42% see the importance of that global cooperation that you have been talking about. And then we have the rest talking about sustainable farming. On that point, I wanted to go back to Thomas and ask you about the smallholders. And we've had a viewer question from Irene in Zambia. And she says, have you developed any communication models to create awareness among smallholder farmers about how important their productivity is in this fight against global hunger?
Absolutely. So as we execute our insurance solution, one of the things we have to do is actually collect yields at farm level. And over the last 5 years, we've collected the largest yield database in Africa. Every year we collect about 100,000 yield data points. And not only do we collect the output, which is a yield, but also we do surveys to understand what production methodologies they used, what seed they used, what fertilizer they used. So for the first time on the continent, we have a feedback loop for smallholder farmers. So this is data we have to collect for purposes of executing our insurance solution. But then this data becomes very important in understanding what are the drivers of productivity at farm level. And this is not based on optimal or assumptions and perfect farm farms, but this is a reality on the ground. Then now using this data and of course combined with analytics, then we use mobile technologies to start communicating to these farmers, because you've seen the penetration of mobile is around 60-70% in actually most of the communities that we work in. And we've actually, across about 6.5 million farmers, we have access to their mobile numbers, and we continuously communicate to them to advise them on the best farming practices to adopt. And this is actually not based on the perfect environment. This is based on actual data that we've collected on the ground. And we do that in a way that it's actionable. So we actually don't just tell them, look, just give them facts, right? It's a case of, we've realized based on data that farmers in this particular area are using probably the wrong fertilizer, or they're using the wrong seed, or actually they could increase by their input, say by their productivity by 40-50%. By sort of adopting a certain farming methodology, then we actually tell them, we advise you should do 1, 2, 3, and this is purely informed by data on the ground.
It's amazing to hear of the progress in that space and how you're really able to work with farmers, as you say, in this kind of real-time, data-driven way to provide advice. Really impressive. So good luck with that. Now, thank you very much, Thomas and David. It's been great to have you with us. And I'd like to welcome back Mark Sussman and Ian Bremmer for the final segment and for their thoughts on the discussion that we've had so far. So I'm going to start with Mark. You know, we've heard lots of ideas about solutions at different scales. We've also heard about the complexity of the problem. As you reflect on that, what do you think are the most important things that we must do to future-proof our global food system?
Well, I think there's a short-term and a medium-term way of looking at it. The short-term, I don't want to underestimate the scale of the current crisis and the numbers we started with. It is urgent we have that both and, the immediate humanitarian response that is desperately needed in so many countries, but also increased investment in real time to support agricultural development and food production. And that's having to deal with some of those problems that Thomas talked about in real time and I alluded to. You know, if fertilizer prices are 5 times what they were a year ago in a place like Nigeria, that's going to have a knock-on consequence on agricultural productivity there over the next 12 to 15 months. Currently, when there is a fertilizer price war globally, as is going on, as happened with vaccines or other tools, the least developed countries and less developed countries tend to lose out because they are unable to purchase scale, and certainly smallholder farmers aren't able to. So we do need sustained attention and political attention and focus both at the national level by the developing countries themselves, the low and middle income countries themselves, and by the global community. But more broadly, as you've also heard, I think there are some really important medium-term opportunities to be optimistic about. That you heard Thomas talking about the advances that we have made in terms of ways to reach out to and help smallholder farmers across the world. He was using examples in Kenya and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but this is true in South Asia and elsewhere, where you can massively increase productivity. You can use improved seeds. We invest heavily as the Gates Foundation in new, drought-tolerant maize seeds and other tools which are starting to be rolled out, or flood-resistant rice that's been rolled out in India and Bangladesh that can actually stay submerged for a couple of weeks and so will still stay productive in the case of floods. And we also have tools available. You talked about the need to customize fertilizer application. We've been primary supporters of an effort to provide a sort of digital soil atlas across sub-Saharan Africa, where you can actually go down to very small plots of land and actually analyze the soil. These are tools available to farmers in wealthier countries like the US. And now we're able to do the same in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where you can then customize the amount and type of fertilizer that's being used in order to provide, maximize productivity, to try and get that doubling of agricultural productivity that Thomas talked about. And last but not least, that is absolutely a critical component of the climate adaptation side of the climate. And we saw in the poll, people saw climate change as one of the key issues for medium and long-term food security, and that's absolutely correct. But it's also true that global adaptation, which is where we at the Gates Foundation focus, which is investing in those tools for better water use, for improved agricultural productivity, for dealing with drought and flood resistance, is way, way, way underinvested in compared to climate mitigation, which remains incredibly important. And we do need to see those investments scaled up, because it actually is incredibly important for both food security, but longer term economic productivity and the ability to come back to that upward trajectory of growth and opportunity that we saw over the last couple of decades, and that currently we're facing those very, very heavy headwinds.
Yeah, there's a heavy lift to do there, as you said, because we need the money to go into adaptation, and we also need to find those solutions and find those crops that will grow under the right circumstances, and find the irrigation solutions, the solar technology, etc., that enable us to move forward and enable particularly these countries to develop in a low carbon way and really adapt to the climate. So hugely important work. Now, in terms of optimism a little bit, Ian, you have a new book out in which you talk about a Goldilocks crisis as a type of crisis. Perhaps you can explain what you mean by that and tell us whether you think that food security could qualify as a Goldilocks crisis.
Well, it's not a crisis that's so small that we don't need to address with the reforms in institutions and architecture and the resources to make a structural difference going forward. So, for example, it's not January 6th, where that evening a majority of Republicans in the House voted not to certify the election. Why? Because it wasn't considered a big enough crisis. And we feel that today. It's not gun violence in the United States with a lot of performative thoughts and prayers, but you don't actually respond because it's not a big enough deal. It's closer to Ukraine, not after 2014, but this year, right? For 8 years, it wasn't a Goldilocks crisis. No one really cared. Now it is. Now it's a big enough deal that NATO is actually expanding and reorienting and restructuring. And the Europeans are putting real money towards defense and national security. And they recognize they made big mistakes in becoming too dependent on the Russians for energy. So Ukraine today and Russia have become a Goldilocks crisis. I'd argue that climate change 20 years ago wasn't. And today it is, precisely because it's coming soon to a theater near all of us. And every year we recognize that our priors are being more confirmed, that we need to do more. It's not political Dem versus Republican in the US or left versus right on the global stage, or even poor versus rich. Everyone understands we have to respond to climate change. Just a question of how fast and what policies we're applying. Do we believe that global food is presently a Goldilocks crisis? We're not there yet, but I think we're moving in that direction. Absolutely. And I think everyone on this panel today shows a recognition that the level of not only deep human distress that is presently being felt, but also the massive political ramifications that will come as a consequence of not adequately addressing this on the back of the pandemic over the last few years will be an immense problem for all of us.
But are you saying things have to get worse on the food security front before they get better?
Well, let me put it this way. You hope that they don't get worse. You hope that this gets resolved because we end the blockade through negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the UN and Turkey. You hope that countries don't take on more protectionism and are more willing and capable of opening marketplaces for greater efficiency. And you hope that we don't have knock-on effects in terms of countries collapsing under the weight of greater interest rates and debt burdens that will cause more problems. But absent that, right? If you want to have structural fixes, I'm arguing that, yeah, the problem has to get bigger. And look, we just had the G7 summit, and I was delighted to see the German chancellor inviting heads of state from some of the poorer countries around the world, from Senegal, for example, from Argentina, for example, and others, and invite them explicitly to say, we are here to listen. We want to understand where we're getting it wrong and what's your priority, and how do we need to respond as the developed world to what you've just experienced on the pandemic and what you're experiencing now with food stress. But the German chancellor saying that at a summit is very different than the world's wealthy countries applying the kind of resources that are critically necessary. And so I believe there are geopolitical solutions here, but I don't want to pretend that we're close to resolving them.
Thank you. Mark, we've covered a huge amount of material today, but I'm going to give you the last word. What do you hope that viewers take away from this segment today, this episode today?
Well, first, that this is a real meaningful crisis at a global, regional, and national level that deserves everyone's attention, and that we want to try and make sure that politicians and policymakers, as Ian's talking about, are taking it seriously. Second, that there are tools and interventions and responses that are possible, feasible, meaningful to address both the humanitarian response in the short term, which is desperately needed, and to build on the lessons that we can over the medium and longer term, even in the lowest income countries, create more resilience and self-sufficiency and increase agricultural productivity. That we have the tools, we have the science, we have the knowledge, but what we need is the political will and the resources. And as Ian said, while it is encouraging that the German Chancellor called, and others, while it's encouraging that the G7 put out a statement, the actual level of commitment to date has been far, far short of what is really needed, and far, far short of what the world actually did, as I mentioned, over a decade ago when we faced a similar crisis. And so that is where the gap is. And, I don't think we're at that Goldilocks space yet, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that you see the intersections between the food security crisis, the wider crisis around how you do poverty reduction and resume economic growth, and how you engage and see it so clearly linked to the climate crisis, will help ensure that we keep this issue elevated, that we do focus on those short-term crisis needs, but that in the medium term, we see this as an area for incredible possibility for both global cooperation, but right down to the national level and right down to the farm level, as we heard from Thomas and others, that this is an area and a most critical area of sort of opportunity for human solidarity, if that doesn't sound too broad, that actually has knock-on effects that provide you better political stability and broader economic growth, which is what I think everybody wants to see.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, really important. And thank you all for watching. You can follow GZERO's continuing coverage of the food crisis. Just head to gzeromedia.com/hunger pains. I'm Diana Fox-Carney. Have a great afternoon.